Virgin Orbit's story does not begin with an empty hangar or a fake rocket. It begins with the kind of image every space startup wants: a real aircraft in the sky, carrying a real rocket on a real mission to reach orbit. That is what makes this graveyard story so uncomfortable. The company was not selling a slide deck about a fantasy launch system forever. It proved that an air launched rocket could get to orbit. Then the business still ran out of cash and ended in Chapter 11. That is the promise in one sentence: orbit, then bankrupt. The mystery is not whether the hardware ever worked, the mystery is why working hardware was not enough. Most bankrupt rocket stories ask whether the machine was ever real. This one asks a worse question. Once reality arrived, why could it not buy enough trust, time, and cash to keep the launch campaign alive? Because in launch, the physics can be solved on camera while the company is dying off camera. Virgin Orbit's collapse is the story of a rocket that could leave the airplane, climb toward space, and still fail to carry the business model with it. The core idea was simple enough to understand in one picture. Take a modified Boeing 747 called Cosmic Girl. Mount a rocket called Launcher 1 under its wing. Fly the aircraft high above the ground, release the rocket from the plane, then let the rocket ignite and continue toward orbit. Instead of beginning with a traditional launch pad, Virgin Orbit built the story around a flying launch platform. That made the company instantly different. It looked flexible, it looked reusable in the ordinary sense that an airplane can land, be serviced, and fly again. It also gave the company a visual identity that most launch startups would kill for: a jumbo jet with a rocket tucked beneath it. Before the bankruptcy filings, before the failed UK launch, before the Capitol wall, this was the image people were meant to remember. A rocket company had taken one of the most familiar machines in aviation and turned it into the opening act of a space mission. That image mattered because it made the pitch feel concrete before anyone saw the balance sheet. Viewers could understand the system in seconds, investors and customers still had to believe the system could be repeated. That promise was not silly. For small satellites, the pitch had a clean emotional pull. If launch could start from an aircraft instead of only from a fixed pad, then access to orbit might feel more mobile, more responsive, and less trapped by the old geography of spaceflight. Virgin Orbit was not just selling metal, it was selling a different route to space. That matters because failed companies are too easy to mock after the ending is known. From the outside, air launch had a kind of elegance. The aircraft does the first visible lift, the rocket takes over later. The customer sees a path that feels more tailored than standing in line for someone else's giant launch vehicle. But this is where the trap begins. A clever launch method only matters if the company can afford to keep proving it. Flexibility is a promise. A launch business is a machine that eats cash while it waits for the next mission to work. If the next mission slips, fails, or needs more preparation, the promise does not pause its bills. The airplane may be reusable, but the company still has to fund every specialized step around it. Under that elegant image sat a much heavier operating stack. Virgin Orbit needed the aircraft. It needed rockets. It needed manufacturing, mission operations, launch customers, technical credibility, regulatory patience, and continuous capital. Each launch was not just a sale, it was a coordinated aerospace operation. That distinction is the first key to the collapse. A demonstration can prove that something is possible. A business has to prove that it can do the thing repeatedly, sell it often enough, and finance the gaps between attempts. Those gaps matter. A rocket company does not become cheap because one mission goes right. The team, the facilities, the testing, the hardware, and the next campaign still have to be paid for. So the real question was never only whether Launcher 1 could reach orbit, it was whether Virgin Orbit could turn that capability into a durable commercial cadence before the money ran thin. The rocket had to fly, but the spreadsheet had to fly too. That is the brutal counterfactual. If Virgin Orbit had only needed to prove the physics once, this would be a success story. Because it needed to prove a repeatable business, the same achievement became only the opening requirement. And the rocket did fly. That is the part of the story that separates Virgin Orbit from a cleaner scam narrative or a simple vaporware failure. The company reached orbit before it entered the graveyard. It had more technical proof than many space startups ever get. That should change the way the collapse feels. If a company never launches anything, the lesson is easy. The promise was ahead of the product. Virgin Orbit is harder. Here, the product had crossed a major line. The public could see real flight imagery, real hardware, and a real air launch system that was more than a rendering. Success made the story more impressive, but it also made the failure more revealing. Because once orbit is real, the easy excuse disappears. You cannot explain the ending by saying the whole thing was imaginary. So if the rocket worked, why did the business still run out of sky? The answer is that technical credibility can buy attention, but it cannot automatically buy time. In fact, proof can raise the stakes. Once people believe the system is real, they stop asking whether it can happen once and start asking whether it can happen on schedule for customers, often enough to justify the whole company. Success did not make the model cheap. That is the corporate graveyard pattern hiding in the open. A breakthrough can make a company look safer right at the moment its balance sheet is becoming more fragile. Virgin Orbit still had to keep an expensive launch operation alive between missions. It still had to convince customers and investors that the next campaign would justify the cost of staying in the game. And in a capital-intensive business, the gap between one proof point and a repeatable market can be brutal. The company was not selling a software feature that could be patched overnight and pushed to millions of users. It was trying to operate aircraft, rockets, launch campaigns, and mission teams. Every pause had weight. Every failure threatened confidence. Every funding delay shortened the runway. This is why the story is not really about one dramatic explosion or one bad headline. It is about a business where even good news had to be strong enough to pay for the next round of risk. The danger was cumulative. A mission delay does not erase rent, payroll, testing needs, or customer expectations. A launch failure does not arrive alone. It arrives with a new bill for investigation, recovery, and renewed confidence. Then came the failed UK launch, the public turning point that made the hidden pressure visible. By then, Virgin Orbit had already built a credibility story around air launch. It had shown that the method could work. That made the failure sharper, not softer. A failed launch before proof can be dismissed as part of development. A failed launch after proof asks a more dangerous question: can the company recover, repeat, and keep confidence alive? The UK mission mattered because it arrived inside that larger tension. The company was not only trying to fix a technical outcome, it was trying to protect the idea that air launch was reliable enough, fundable enough, and commercially real enough to keep going. The failed UK launch hurt, but the fatal question was whether anyone would fund the next attempt. In a cash-heavy launch business, recovery is not just engineering. Recovery is payroll, hardware, operations, and investor belief arriving before the clock runs out. That is why the failed UK launch sits in the middle of the story, not at the end. It was not the entire cause by itself. It was the moment when technical recovery and financial recovery had to happen at the same time. That is where the story moves from the sky to the capital wall. Virgin Orbit needed more money and could not raise enough to keep the business operating as before. This is the coldest part of the graveyard because it turns the romantic space story into a funding story. A company can have hardware that works, a brand people recognize, and a mission profile that looks different on camera. None of that guarantees the next check. When the market stops funding the next step, a working technology can become stranded. The SEC filing is the hard turn in this story because it moves the collapse from analysis into official record. The question is no longer whether the concept was interesting, it clearly was. The question is whether the company had enough runway to survive the cost of making the concept repeatable. For Virgin Orbit, the answer became no. The rocket could separate from the aircraft. The company could not separate itself from the economics of staying alive. This is where a normal product story breaks down. In ordinary businesses, a working product can sometimes pull in revenue quickly. In orbital launch, each sale still depends on mission readiness, customer timing, and confidence that the company will be there for the next flight. Chapter 11 made the ending official. The same story that opened with a rocket under a 747 now had to be read through bankruptcy evidence and public coverage of the collapse. That contrast is the whole episode. On one side, flight imagery, motion, altitude, proof, ambition. On the other side, a court process, documents, claims, reorganization, and the admission that the company could not keep operating in the form it had promised. The human and operational consequences sit behind those documents because a launch company is not only hardware, it is teams, schedules, customers, suppliers, and years of work organized around the belief that the next mission will justify the last one. Chapter 11 explains the ending, but the lesson is what the working rocket hid. Virgin Orbit did not become a graveyard case because the visual promise was boring. It became one because the visible proof of orbit could not overcome the invisible demand for continuous capital. Bankruptcy also changed the meaning of the earlier imagery. The plane and rocket no longer looked only like ambition. They became evidence of how much money, coordination, and belief had been required just to get that far. That is why Virgin Orbit matters beyond one company. It separates three kinds of proof that people often blur together. First, there is technical proof. Can the thing work at all? Virgin Orbit had that. Second, there is operating proof. Can the company do it again and again with enough reliability to support real customers? That was harder. Third, there is business proof. Can the company fund the operation long enough at terms that make sense while setbacks happen in public? That was the wall. A lot of capital-heavy innovation companies look strongest at the first kind of proof. The demo works, the image is unforgettable, the story is easy to sell. But the graveyard is full of companies that confuse proof of concept with proof of business. Virgin Orbit is a clean example because it removes the lazy explanation. The rocket was not the whole problem. The company around the rocket had to become repeatable, trusted, and financed before the cash ran out. That lesson is uncomfortable because it does not give viewers an easy villain. The idea was not absurd, and the evidence of flight was real. The failure lived in the gap between a valid technical system and a business that could not keep financing its next proof point. So the final image should not be a rocket that never flew. It should be two images held together, Launcher 1 in the air and Chapter 11 on the record. That is the real contradiction the title promises. Virgin Orbit reached orbit, then still went bankrupt. The graveyard lesson is not that air launch was impossible, and it is not that every ambitious space company is doomed. The lesson is sharper than that. A company can solve enough physics to make history and still fail the financing test that keeps the doors open. It can build a machine that leaves a 747 and climbs toward space while the business beneath it is running out of runway. That is why this story sticks. The rocket worked, the company did not. And once you see that gap, every capital-heavy startup starts to look different. Not as a question of whether the demo can work once, but whether the business can survive long enough to make success routine. That is the promise for the next corporate graveyard too, not just who failed, but which proof looked convincing right before the business model stopped breathing.